So I've had a lot of our members that have asked about using acrylics to do the washes, the initial washes on a painting, and then painting oils over that. So is that a good idea or not? I'm going to talk about that right now. All right, so the science behind all of this is pretty tricky. I had to go through a lot of different research papers and everything else to get a good handle on the best practices when it comes to painting oils over acrylics. So I've been using acrylic grounds since the 90s. In the 80s and the early 90s, my dad and I, we actually we did it all from scratch. We painted on linen, and in fact, this canvas right here, this is one of the ones we did back in about 88, 89. So pretty old, and you can see, I mean, this thing is still taut as a drum. Beautiful stuff, and it was done with a lead primer. So, and I have a big roll of lead priming in my back tool room. So, which I've had for about 10 years and I haven't used for a long time. When in producing this kind of thing, this lead primed canvas, it's pretty toxic stuff. So, and the process for that is generally you have to protect the canvas from the oil, because oil will, at least on natural fibers like canvas, it'll rot it, it'll deteriorate it, and over time that's really bad for the paintings as well. So, especially if you don't have anything that's holding it together, it's not going to work out too well. So and part of the thing with all that is all the things we have to use to get to that point, like turpentines and solvents and all these and other solvents, things that are just terrible for our health. And then I started to read some papers by some conservators back in the 90s, and there still isn't. There's a lot of unknowns out there. The National Gallery of Art, Tate Museum, all these different museums around the world, different researchers are trying to figure out the best way to restore old paintings and prevent paintings today from deteriorating worse than they have, or ones that haven't really deteriorated that much. How do we keep paintings today from getting into any bad condition, like cracking and delaminating, and I know there's all kinds of different things that can happen with a painting. So with something like lead prime linen, you have to use a size that usually ends up being like an animal skin glue, rabbit skin glue, because it will protect the surface of the canvas, the natural fibers, from the oils that go on top, especially the primer that we put on there. It protects it from that and keeps it from rotting. Problem with animal skin glues is that they're hygroscopic. They absorb moisture from the air. And if there's enough moisture, if the humidity gets to be, I don't know, if we live somewhere like the Amazon and the humidity is just crazy high, it'll absorb that moisture, and that can cause problems because it never actually dries. Okay, it does dry, but if it gets wet again, it will go back into its wet consistency. So the more water that it absorbs, the more problems it can create, and that's not good for our oil paintings. Besides that, even with an oil primer like this, I've had this for quite a while, this Gamblin oil painting ground. The things are toxic to breathe. The fumes from them are terrible. And you still have to have, so on wood, you could use something like that and it would be just fine. If you have it on a wood panel, the wood's not going to deteriorate because of painting oil on it. The problem with wood, we don't want to just paint oil straight on wood because the wood is so absorbent, it's going to take all the oil binder out of the oil paints, and then they become flaky. And we don't want just pigment. If we could just use pigment, we would do that. It has to have something to bind it together to keep it stable so it's not in powder form. Otherwise, we can just brush it off of there or blow it off of there, right? So with wood, if we just painted oil right on wood, it absorbs so much of that oil binder that it becomes unstable. The oil paint does. So we use something like a ground, like an oil ground or a lead ground or an acrylic ground. So in the 90s, I read this conservator that said that testing at that time was showing that acrylic grounds, oil paints over acrylic grounds, were actually working out better in the long run than the traditional, using hide skin or animal skins and glues and stuff like that. So I thought, I'm good. I'll jump ship right off because I didn't like the toxic fumes from an oil ground. I didn't like the incredible preparation that went into a lead ground, and then having to wait 6 months to a year to be able to use that to paint on. That's a crazy amount of time invested there. So all of those things, I want to be able to put together my canvas, my panel, whatever it is, and paint quickly. I'm not much for the busy work kind of thing, especially like cleaning brushes and stuff like that. But I also am very adamant about staying healthy because my final, one of my main art professors that I would go out painting with, that I learned my more Russian bravura style of painting from, by the time he was 65, he couldn't paint with oils anymore. He'd used turpentines and things like that so much in his studio without good ventilation that he had built up this toxicity in his body. He just got around it and he got sick. So I decided early on, that was a good example for me, bad for him, good example for me of keeping myself healthy. So I jumped ship quick when I read that a conservator was saying to do that. But then of course things go back and forth, and a lot of people are saying, like Gamblin today, Robert Gamblin says that he deters oil painting artists away from using an acrylic ground because it's only been around since the 50s. And he says that with the traditional, it's been around for hundreds of years. That's true. But with the tests that they've done with oil paints over an acrylic ground, there have been no problems, except from something like zinc oxides. That's a completely different problem that they're talking about there. But as far as the adhesion goes, oil paints adhere really well to acrylics. So, and yet, when it comes to using acrylic paints for our initial washes, I'm going to say no. And let me tell you why. So, this is what I'm using nowadays. Either, they come in black or white. This is ABS plastic. I use ABS plastic panels to paint on because I found out that the MDF panels that I was using forever have formaldehyde in them, which leaches out into my studio, into the air here, and I'm breathing that all the time. I still have a ton of MDF panels around, but unless they're sealed really well with something like an Ecos air purifying primer. It's one of the only things I've found that you can paint all the sides and everything, front, back, and all the sides of the panel with that Ecos air purifying primer, and it will actually seal in formaldehyde and all the other VOCs that are escaping into the air. But that's a real hassle as well, and it's highly absorbent. The problem with a highly absorbent ground for oil paints is that if it's too absorbent, it's going to be like that wood. It's going to pull the oils out of the oil paint, and the oil is the binder. It's what keeps it, it's what forms that strong shell on the oil paints. So we don't want that. We don't want to get too absorbent. A regular acrylic gesso is absorbent, but it's not so much that it's going to pull too much of the oil out of there. If we're worried about it, we can always put just a layer of oil on our painting before we even start. Watch that though, because if you get too much oil, let me explain this here. If you get too much oil, it's going to bead up on there. Why does it bead up? Because the reason why oil adheres to acrylic and not the other way around, acrylic will not adhere to oil paints if you paint acrylic on top of it. Yes, some people have done that and they'll say my paints are still there a few years later. The problem is if they go over and they flex that at all, or they take like a palette knife and they start to peel it, it will peel right off of there because there is no kind of a bond there. With oil to oil, it's a chemical bond. With acrylic to acrylic, it's a chemical bond. They start to fuse to one another, the oil to oil and acrylic to acrylic. With oil on top of acrylic, why does it work? Because acrylic, even in a state like this, where it's hard, see this stuff doesn't flex at all hardly. This is a 1/4 inch ABS panel. And I love this stuff. It's great. It's nice and stable, although it depends on the brand too. I get these from a local plastics company, and you can see that if I take this one, it's a 1/4 inch, I can still flex it. But I have to put quite a bit of pressure on it. Now if I get it to a panel like the size of, whoa, where's it at? Back here, right there, I have a 30 by 40 inch panel that I'm getting ready to paint on. When you start getting in big sizes like that, even the 1/4 inch gets a lot more flex in it. That can be dangerous for oil paints once they've dried. But in the initial stages, oil paints are very flexible and for years down the line. They continue to be just as flexible as, or I can't say just as flexible, but they have extreme flexibility to them for at least 2 to 3 years down the line. So I'm not worried about that with my acrylic panels for a while because I'm going to be putting them into a frame. That frame is going to keep them from flexing. It's still a lot more stable than trying to do it with a canvas, like this linen canvas behind me or a cotton canvas. Those things have a lot more flex to them. I used those things for a long time, almost 20 years before I switched to MDF panels, and then I switched just recently to ABS plastic. Now, getting back to ABS plastic, why, or to any kind of acrylic or plastic, why does oil paint adhere to it? Because it's full of little tiny microscopic holes. Those holes allow the oil to go in and grab into it. And that's where that mechanical bond comes from. It's those little tiny porous holes in the acrylic. No matter how, even on a glossy surface, they've done tests with more glossy surfaces with acrylic, and the oil paint still adheres to it. It still bonds to it. They do all kinds of crazy tests with folding it and all that sort of thing. On a canvas, it'll still hold to it because it's getting into those little porous. Every bit of plastic is porous. It's just porous. And so that's where the oil is getting in there and bonding to it. Now, I wouldn't suggest yet, I'm going to do some tests with it. I wouldn't suggest yet using it with this really highly glossy surface that it comes with. This is how ABS plastic comes. This first glossy surface, and then like a pebbly surface on the back, a texture surface. But both of them are pretty slick. So I take a 60 grit sandpaper and I sand all that gloss off of it. And then no problems at all. I have tested this where I go in and I try to scrape it off. It will not scrape off of there. After just a month or two of drying, I will go in and try to scrape it off with my palette knives, with a razor blade, with all kinds of stuff. It is bonded to that stuff. It's not coming off of there. And that's because of that porosity. So why not use acrylic paints then, which have this, also have porosity to them? Why not use that for our initial washes? Because they dry faster, and it's stable enough to paint an oil paint over the top of it. The reason for that is because most of us, in fact, I didn't realize this until recently, even though acrylic paints will dry to the touch in about 30 minutes, it's not actually dry all the way through, even with thin layers, for 2 to 3 days. And we're not supposed to paint on top of acrylic with oil until it is thoroughly dry. It's kind of like what they say about varnishing any kind of painting. Wait until it's thoroughly dry. Although now with this is the varnish I use now, the Gamvar. I think Golden has a good one too. This stuff can be removed with mineral spirits. Excellent, excellent varnish. It doesn't yellow. It always stays that clear color, and you can take it off with mineral spirits, which is the most mild solvent that we have. So this, Gamblin developed this in connection with the National Gallery of Art. They worked together on it. That's what they came up with. And Golden has something, I think, comparable to it. I don't know a lot about Golden's. varnish. But you can varnish that over oil, acrylic, alkyd, anything like that. So it works for both oil and acrylic, which is really nice. The thing about oil paints, first of all, when people are out on location, especially for plein air painting, when we're wanting to paint quickly, we have a short period of time. That's why some people, I paint wet into wet, so it's not a big deal for me to do my early washes and I just paint right back into them. That doesn't concern me. Some people love the idea of having that initial wash dry when they go to paint back on top of it. And since acrylic dries so quickly, they can do that in a relatively short period of time. The problem is now we know that it takes 2 to 3 days. Nobody, when they're plein air painting, wants to wait 2 to 3 days for that initial wash to dry before they paint on it. Another thing is that acrylics and oils are different in the way solvents react with them. So mineral spirits, which is what can take off this varnish, isn't really corrosive to either acrylics or oils. At least it's one of the least damaging to acrylics of the solvents that they use out there. They don't use it in conservation for like cleaning and stuff because it really isn't very good at cleaning. But it doesn't necessarily affect the oil too much. Other solvents though, like xylene and other things, they will actually degloss or desaturate the color in acrylics. And other things like water even can affect acrylics, where it's not going to affect the oil paints. As long as the oil paint hasn't cracked or something like that, it forms a hard shell. So if in the future we go and we think, oh, I want to do some touch-ups or some changes, and we take that varnish off, or if we're just using some, there are certain mediums and things that like when we do glazes and things like that, I don't know. For the most part, it's not going to affect me either because I don't use mediums, and when I do glazes, I'm just using oil, walnut oil. So it's not a big deal. That's not going to affect the acrylics. But it's good to keep in mind that acrylics are affected by certain solvents that don't affect oil paints. So it does limit us there, especially when, for me, my underpaintings, I leave them many times spots of that oil painting coming through. A lot of people like to put down like a unifying color, maybe a burnt sienna or something like that as a wash over their whole canvas, because they know that little bits of that are going to come through over the whole painting, little tiny spots that create kind of a harmonizing tone or color throughout all the other colors in the painting. But even without that, when I'm painting, I like to do a lot of dry brush glazing, and so I have parts of that underpainting that I want to come through in the end, or I might leave areas that are more washy and then other areas that are more refined and finished looking. There are so many different techniques we can do with oil painting. It really depends on what we're trying to achieve. But we don't want, it's not advisable to use two different media like that can be affected by different solvents in different ways. And of course the dry time. So there is an alternative to it though that works out great. So I just want to do the caveat here. Acrylics and oils, they're both great mediums, or paint media to use. There's so many, they're just different. But there are a lot of pros to both of them and cons to both of them as well. I happen to love oil paint, so so for me, I'm trying to find those things that are going to work well for oil painting. And acrylics overall, where an acrylic ground, I think, even though Gamblin doesn't like the idea of it because he doesn't think it's been tested enough, I feel strongly that it has been, or for myself, not for anybody else, but for myself, I feel strongly that it has been, and I love working on this ABS plastic because it's going to last. I mean, the plastic itself isn't going to deteriorate with any appreciable deterioration for hundreds of years. Better than anything else out there. Wood, canvas, anything else, there's nothing that's going to compete with it. Even aluminum isn't going to compete with that. So it's fairly inexpensive, a lot less expensive than aluminum, like Dye Bond or something like that. A lot easier to work with. I can paint directly on this. I don't have to gesso it. It's just so easy. So painting on top of acrylics in that way, I think is fantastic. And as far as testing has gone, it shows that it's good to do. So if we're out on location, and so for me, I paint wet into wet. The initial washes, I'm not too concerned about it. But for those artists, and there are a lot of them who are like this, for a lot of artists, they want to have in their initial washes some way to work with it in a way that it'll dry so that they don't disturb it, and they can work over it and have that as kind of like their blueprint to follow. And they also do that so that the colors don't get blended together, things like that. And another reason for something like not doing the oils is to be able to rework a composition. So if we're out on location and we're trying to decide on the layout, let's say we have, I don't know, filled with some trees and a river and mountains or whatever, and we have some trees that work really well in our composition, but some trees that don't seem to be quite in the spots that we want them. We move things around, that sort of thing. Well, let's say we go through, we put down the composition, the design that we want, and we're thinking, I don't know, I don't think this is quite it. Well, with acrylics, the idea of it is that you could then just, it dries quick, you could paint over it, change things around easily. With oil paint, you have to wipe it off, start over again, but it can be problematic sometimes, especially as we start to get white added into our paint. It's just a little bit more cumbersome to try to wipe something off and start over again. It's very possible, I do it all the time, but it's more cumbersome. But something that is a fantastic idea is to use watercolor. So watercolor, so I have a caveat here. With watercolor, you don't necessarily want, okay, no, never mind, forget all that. With watercolor, just make sure that you don't use opaque watercolor like a gouache or something like that. We're talking about a transparent watercolor in some type of a glaze. And you can paint it directly onto an acrylic ground without any problems. Now, the thing about watercolor is it's always water soluble. No matter how long it sits around, no matter how dry it gets, you can take water and reconstitute it. It's going to become, you can move that color around or remove it or whatever. But if you put mineral spirits over it or oils over it or a varnish over it, they're not going to affect it at all. So if we use watercolor for those initial washes, then instead of acrylics, they dry instantly. I mean, basically, they dry instantly. We don't have to wait for them to dry. And as long as we don't use a opaque pigment, like get the watercolor too thick, the reason you wouldn't want to get it too thick is what we talked about before. That increased pigment, the water is going to evaporate just like that out of that watercolor. Then you're left with this pigment. That pigment is a lot more absorbent, and it's going to soak up some of those oils from our paints and make our paints a little less stable. And besides that, it can become powdery, and that can cause some problems. Just like, I don't know, any kind of dirt, if we have, you know what I mean, right? We don't want to have anything too absorbent on when we're working with oil paints. So the absorbency of something like this isn't sufficient enough to pull enough oil out of it. It's just grabbing enough oil into that porosity of the acrylic to help it bind to it. But it's not sucking out so much that, like wood, it'll continue to leach down in there. With the acrylic, it only does it so far, and then it stops. So it's not leaching all that acrylic or all that oil binder out of our oils till it becomes just a powder on there. We don't have to worry about that. With watercolor, it's the same thing, as long as we don't get it too thick. So then that dries, and voila, if we don't like our composition, we take a little water and wipe it off of there. Easy peasy. So instead of using, and the reason I brought all this up is because I didn't know a lot of this stuff. When I was going along, people have talked to me about doing acrylic underpaintings for a long time, and I know some professional artists that do that. And I thought, I don't know, it sounds like a good idea. I just don't have any acrylics. So right now, I'm not too concerned about it because the way I paint, it wasn't a big thing for me. But I thought, there might be some opportunities with it, some possibilities. So maybe I'll try it out someday. Now I know there's a much better way, using watercolors instead of acrylics. So my recommendation is use acrylics with acrylics, use oils with oils, and if you want to do an underglazing or the initial washes with something besides oils, then use watercolor. It works out great, it's easy, and you can varnish over it. Now, in the future, if somebody removes that varnish and they get any water on there and you have any of that watercolor still showing through, then there might be some problems, because most solvents that they use to clean paintings with, the first thing they start with is just a dry brush. But after that, they're water-based solvents, like water and something like that. So that can actually cause problems with the watercolor. So you'd want to seal that watercolor with like oil over it or something. At least in the long run, put something over it besides just the varnish, because once they remove that varnish, most of us don't have to worry about this sort of thing, but even for your sake, or for our sake as artists, we might forget. I know I paint with things, and 20, 30 years down the line, I don't know what I used way back when necessarily on a particular painting. So if we're ever worried about it, just remember that watercolor is always going to come back be reconstituted by water, or any solvents that have water in them. So just watch that, pay attention to that. But otherwise, it's a great substitute for acrylic underpaintings, and easy to work with. And you can use the same brushes. Okay, so yeah, I used a lot of my oil painting brushes to do watercolors when I was in art school, and they work out great. I loved using bristle brushes for my watercolors. So don't be afraid of that either. You don't have to get all these fancy watercolor brushes to do it with. Use anything, it all works. It's just that, remember, if you have oil in the brush, then that might cause you some problems. But if your brush is cleaned out well and there's no oil in there, it's good to go. So anyway, have fun. And for all those who have contemplated doing an acrylic underpainting, well, now you know that you have an alternative. And if you do an acrylic underpainting, you know that you should probably wait 2 to 3 days before you go and paint oils on top of it. And if you've thought about doing acrylic painting on top of oils, I wouldn't recommend it. There is no mechanical bond there. It might be sticking to it, and it might do that for a few years, but it's really not bonded. It's just sticking there, kind of like something that sticks to glass for a while, and then suddenly it peels off, like those vinyl stickers or something. It's not really bonded to it, and you can always get it off of there eventually. Same thing with acrylic over oil. There's no bonding. So have fun with that. I hope that helps, and happy painting.